All right, well, it's 6:04. I think we'll get started. Before I turn things over to Joey to start us off, if everybody could, at some point during the meeting, put your name and affiliation into the chat, just so we can keep a record. One of the things that we're required to do is keep a record of public participation. So if you could put your name and affiliation into the chat, I'd appreciate it. With that said, I'll hand it over to Joey to give some opening remarks, and then we'll jump right into the content.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Good evening, everyone. My name is Joey Henderson. I'm the Manager for Preparedness and Outreach here with the Office of Homeland Security in Prince George's County. On behalf of our Director Ronald Gill, we'd like to thank you for participating in our first public meeting to help us update our hazard mitigation plan for 2023. And without further ado, we'll turn it back over to Scott so he can lead us through today's meeting.
Right, thank you. My name is Scott Choquette. I work with Dewberry Engineers, and we're hired by PG County to help with the update of the 2017 Hazard Mitigation Plan. We've been fortunate enough to help with the last couple of updates, and I'm just going to lead you through a bit about where we are in terms of progress and some ways that you can provide input as we move forward towards the completion line. If everybody can see the opening slide, I'll move on to the agenda. So we're going to give an overview of the hazard mitigation planning process and an update on where we are with the project. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the hazard identification and risk assessment portion of the plan, a little bit of time talking about mitigation goals, and then talk to you about some next steps and other ways that you can have opportunities to provide input to the plan. So hazard mitigation planning and overview. So what is hazard mitigation? A lot of people know that this is related to flooding and natural hazards and other disasters, but don't understand some of the nuances between hazard mitigation and response and recovery and preparedness and all the other things that we do to be ready for disasters. So what this plan is focused on is mitigation, and that's sustainable actions that we take to reduce or eliminate the injury to citizens, damages to structures, and allow continuity of critical societal functions. So it's an example, probably not a great one for PG County, but mitigation as an example would be defensible space around a building for wildfire, or flood-proofing a building, or creating changes to culverts and stormwater to prevent flooding. It's actions that we take now to reduce damages from future events. So earthquake retrofits, et cetera, those types of things that reduce damages in the future. What it's not is preparedness or response. So like purchases of command and control vehicles, or the things that we do when a disaster is occurring or when we're recovering from one. So we're really focused on the long-term sustainable things that we can do now to prevent damages when disasters do occur. So why are we here doing this planning process? Hazard mitigation, it reduces the need to, or reduces or eliminates the need to respond, which lessens resources or burdens on resources such as public works and public safety and all these other expenditures that occur when there's a disaster. It increases resilience of the community, the county, the cities within the county, and promotes adaptation to changing environments and climates. It produces data sharing between the state and the local and county governments to maximize resources that exist to do the things that we all need to do. It supports decision making for things like capital budgeting and the other priority choices that we have to make with our limited financial resources. And then, as a practical matter, a plan is required in order to access certain FEMA grants and certain forms of FEMA public assistance. So there's a variety of reasons to do this planning in advance. It's common to think like, okay, we know what the problem is, just give us the money to solve it. but the whole kind of premise of this mitigation planning requirement is to organize resources to build a project pipeline, to have things in order so that you can do that efficiently with the resources that are available. So I mentioned some grants that require a plan. A plan is a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan is a requirement, and that plan has to be updated every 5 years in order to remain eligible for certain grant programs. I won't go into a tremendous amount of detail on these, but there's 4 basic programs from FEMA. There's others that we'll discuss briefly. The most recent program is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. That program is an annual program. It's not tied to any disasters, and it provides federal grants with a 75%, 25% cost match in order to do things that protect community lifelines, serve vulnerable populations, and reduce losses. So it can be large infrastructure projects, green infrastructure projects, building retrofits, critical facility retrofits, those types of things, again, that reduce damages from future disasters. It has scoring criteria that adds value to socially vulnerable portions of the county, and it favors green infrastructure projects and large infrastructure projects. It's a new project, a new program. It's very well funded, and it's available each year. And there's currently an open cycle for that grant. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is a post-disaster program where every time there's a presidentially declared disaster in Maryland, roughly 15% of the total damages from that disaster are made available for these proactive loss reduction oriented projects that you can do. So that program, again, requires a presidential disaster declaration, but makes money available for the same types of projects. So think building retrofits, think culverts and bridges, things of that nature, that you can do projects with to reduce damages. There's an HMGP Hazard Mitigation Grant Program post-fire grant funding that we don't see very often in this part of the country. It's more of a California and arid west type of program, but it's basically the same as the one I previously mentioned, only it's targeted towards wildfire loss reduction. And then lastly, there's the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. And that one is really focused on reducing flooding losses to properties that are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program. So really primarily focused on home elevations, acquisitions of repetitively flooded properties, culvert and other types of activities that have proven impacts on reducing losses to properties that are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program. That one is also available annually on the same cycle as the BRIC grant program. So those are the FEMA programs that require this plan to be updated. There are many other reasons other than accessing those programs to do the plan. There's the housing and urban development money after disasters through the community development grant program or block grant program. There's other appropriations, there's state programs. So we encourage everybody not to focus entirely only on the FEMA programs, but to focus on the value of the plan for developing a project pipeline to access a variety of funding programs. So the planning process that we go through on this cycle, this 5-year cycle, I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but basically it's a continuous improvement cycle. So data becomes better, social vulnerability data, climate projection data, flood mapping, other related data. We use that to coordinate, and then capabilities wane or increase or decrease over a 5-year period. So currently there's a lot of programs that exist that did not exist 5 years ago. So we look at the county and the city's capabilities to acquire these grants, manage the programs, regulate areas of concern, et cetera, and identify gaps in those capabilities to address with mitigation strategies moving forward. We update the risk assessment, focusing on changes to the environment, changes to development, changes to the climate, et cetera. And then based on the assessment of risk and vulnerability, we refresh the hazard mitigation strategy each time to look at what do we want to focus on in the next 5 years to help reduce these losses. And then from there, it's like any other strategic planning exercise. You move forward with deciding on implementation procedures, who's going to do what, who's going to pay for it, how it's going to work, what are the priorities. And then there's a process that we go through to get the plan approved by Maryland DEM and FEMA Region 3 so that the eligibility continues for these programs. Some of the update requirements, there's recent guidance that's been put out by FEMA in 2022 that will become effective in April of 2023 that this plan will meet. So there's one of the biggest things is to go through a very kind of prescriptive process and demonstrate that you've followed the process and that you've gotten input from not only the public, which this meeting is about tonight, but stakeholders and others throughout the community, so that this is not a plan that was just written by a consultant and for the county just to check a box. There you have to prove that you've been through a process. Some of the other things that need to be included per the new guidance is the plan needs to reflect changes in development. Are there increased or decreased vulnerabilities or changes in social vulnerabilities? What has climate change done to impact hazards? An example of that is, we used to focus primarily on the FEMA floodplains and the magical 100-year flood event, and now we're seeing a lot of high intensity rainfall events that are causing flooding in areas that didn't used to flood, that are related to drainage, not so much as rivers coming out of their banks. So those types of changes need to be included. Need to look forward to new development, planned development. It's not only fixing what's already in harm's way, but addressing what's going to be built in the future and how we can avoid the same types of problems with that new development. Population changes, regulatory changes, all those types of things. And then reflecting changes in priorities and progress in local mitigation efforts, looking at what we've identified for goals, actions, and projects in the past, how successful the county and its municipalities have been with those projects, and how in the changing environment we move forward and create new strategies that reflect the current realities. So that's a quick highlight of some of the things that are required in the update. So who's involved? And I should have mentioned, this is a 1-hour session we have, and it's not going to take the whole hour. So please absolutely feel free to jump in with questions or comments, or raise your hand with the icon thing at the top of the screen. Happy to make this more conversational. We'll have plenty of times for question and comments. So in terms of involvement, there's at the county level, and there's a mitigation advisory committee, which includes various departments across the county, representatives from the city of Laurel who are also participating in the process. And that is more or less a steering committee who's guiding this plan update process through development. Maryland Department of Emergency Management is a major player. FEMA Region 3 is a major player as the reviewers and approvers. But more critically is the public, the community groups and organizations, critical infrastructure owners, other folks who are stakeholders in this project that we need to involve and have input from. So the planning process, we are on a very, very compressed and challenging schedule for this project. The good news is we're keeping up with it. So we had a kickoff meeting with the advisory committee. We've begun the outreach process. I'm going to present to you in a few minutes a highlight of the draft risk assessment and where things will go in the future. After this meeting, there'll be another public meeting, another opportunity for input, and we'll give you more details on that in a bit. But we'll be moving past finalizing the risk assessment and the vulnerability assessment and focusing on what it shows us and what we can then do with that to move forward and develop strategies before we submit the plan to FEMA sometime in the, or to MDEM sometime in the January timeframe to ensure that the review is done and comments are incorporated in time for an adoption in the March timeframe. Again, schedule is dictated by the requirement to have an approved update in order to be eligible for this grant program. So we don't want to let the schedule slip and jeopardize any opportunities for grants. So the activity that we'll ask you to participate in will really be between now and early January, where you'll have additional opportunities to provide feedback. A quick overview of the hazard ID and risk assessment. The components of that include a hazard ranking. So in the last plan, there were several hazards identified. You have to identify all the hazards that the county and its municipalities are potentially exposed to, provide justification about which ones you include in the plan, and then rank those hazards in terms of kind of importance to the community. And then some of the other steps quickly is create hazard profiles, which basically describe the hazard, talk about the history, talk about how the hazard is changing, talk about how climate change may be impacting that hazard. I gave the example before of the high intensity, short duration rainfall events. Look at history, location, and extent of occurrences. What is at risk in those vulnerable areas, and how do we best quantify what's at risk to do loss estimation? The probability of future events occurring, usually based on historic events over time, extrapolated into the future. We look at potential impacts, and then we look at how all of this syncs up with what the Maryland State Hazard Mitigation Plan shows us. The hazards in the last plan are on the screen. I won't go through all of them, but the plan is focused on natural hazards, so it's not focused on man-made hazards such as terrorism or cyber attacks or viruses and epidemics and pandemics, things of that nature. It's mostly focused on natural hazards. The next slide shows a demonstration of the ranking of those hazards in the last plan update in 2017 versus this plan update in 2022. These rankings were conducted by the Mitigation Advisory Committee, and we'd be very happy to hear input tonight on whether these rankings make sense to stakeholders and the public. But essentially, you can see that the riverine flooding, severe storms, and tornadoes ranked the highest. Coastal flooding ranked down a medium low, etc. across the board. You can see that the one thing that ticked up just slightly in the ranking was extreme heat. There's a lot more emphasis on that and mitigating the impacts of that to socially vulnerable populations. So that one warranted an increase from medium to medium high in this go around, but otherwise the rankings remain mostly the same. And these rankings are not just totally out of the air. They look at the portion of the community impacted, the probability of an occurrence, the impacts of an occurrence. So, like for example, while lightning can be from a severe storm can be very catastrophic to a single building, it doesn't impact the overall county at the same level that a 100-year flood event would. So it takes all these factors, these weighted factors into consideration, and there's a process for going through it to identify this ranking. Also, ranking really means is what level of attention is a particular hazard going to get in the planning process. So this is a good stopping point just for me to reach out and ask, is there any input or feedback on this ranking? Anything that people agree with or don't agree with that we should discuss? Go ahead, Mark. You're on mute.
It seems to me that extreme heat would be in the high category. Just from anecdotal information that I've received, you know, it seems like it's going to be more and more of a problem as time goes on. That's just an anecdotal thought from an amateur.
No, it's a good point. It did get bumped up from 2017, and it's getting a lot of attention at the national level as programs focus more on socially vulnerable populations, and climate change is creating a lot more heat. It probably should say extreme heat and extreme cold, but those events are a lot more frequent now, and FEMA is modifying some of its programs, some of its benefit cost analysis tools to give more emphasis to the economic analysis of projects you can do to combat extreme heat. So
tell me, what is the ramification of the extreme heat, for instance, just being medium high as opposed to high? What is that? How does that translate?
honestly, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. It's in the top tier. In these plans, when you identify a vulnerability, you're required to come up with a comprehensive list of strategies to identify that vulnerability. So the higher it's ranked, the higher the expectation is that you come up with strategies to address it, which makes sense. The difference between medium high and high, probably not a lot. It's more about the appetite of the county and city of Laurel and others and what they want to do with this, what the existing network of cooling centers looks like, whether there's specific needs identified for more of them, or things like tree plantings and shade programs are becoming very popular, and there's grants that are now available for those types of things. So shorter answer is the difference between medium high and high doesn't make a lot of difference. The difference is more what the advisory committee wants to do to address the hazard.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts on the rankings before we move on? Do they make sense in general to most people? Right. So moving a little bit into the risk assessment, that this is going to be literally probably a 75-page portion of the plan. So I'm only touching on a few of the highlights tonight in the interest of time, and hoping that folks will review the draft and provide comments, and we'll talk about how to do that as we move forward. But so to date, there's been 12 major disaster declarations for PG County, 6 for flooding and severe storms, and 5 for winter weather. In terms of active presidential disaster declarations, there's 2. One is an emergency declaration, but 2 are disaster declarations. One for the, I'm sorry, I misspoke. They're not active. The 2016 one is probably closed. So there were severe winter storms in January 2016, and then there's an open disaster for the COVID-19 pandemic. The reason that's important, and I should have pointed it out in the earlier slide when I mentioned the hazard mitigation grant program and how it relies on presidential disaster declarations. Here's an example where Maryland has DR 4491. It's an open disaster for the COVID-19 pandemic. But PG County or the city of Laurel or anybody else, you can apply for hazard mitigation grants to do tornado retrofits, to do flood related projects under that COVID-19 related pandemic funding. So the disaster doesn't have to match the project, and it could be in Frederick County, Maryland. The disaster declaration could be in Frederick County, Maryland, and PG County could apply for an earthquake project under a flood declaration in Frederick County, Maryland. So that's sort of the importance of that. We're going to just touch on a few of these hazards. So one of the updates we're able to do this go around for the plan that we haven't been able to do with previous plans for budget reasons is we're able to do some flood loss estimation using FEMA's modeling software. It's called HAZUS, stands for Hazard US MH. We use version 5.1. I know that probably doesn't mean much to folks, but what this program does is it looks at different return frequency flooding scenarios. Everybody hears about the 100-year flood, which is a flood that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. It takes all of those different scenarios from the 25-year flood up to the 100-year flood, and it looks at not just what's exposed, but what damages might occur based on, and this is a very overly simplified explanation, but based on the topography, the depth of water that might get into a building stock, the types that there's a depth of damage curve, how much damage that water would cause based on how high it got into the buildings, etc., to actually create a loss estimation based on all these different scenarios. And with the multiple scenarios, you can create an annualized loss estimate. The numbers are not perfect. It tends to overestimate in some cases, but it gives you a really good analysis relative from one location in the county to another location. And the map on the right just kind of shows by census block that the number of damage or the amount of damages that are calculated by the tool by census block. So you can see the hot spots and throughout the county. Obviously, it's very coincident with population and density of buildings. Just some numbers to throw up there for riverine flooding loss for the 100-year riverine flood, assuming that it's the perfect statistical match to that flood. Every floodplain is at full bank 100-year flood. You can see some of the predicted losses. So exposure in the first row, that is a huge number, $130 billion for residential. That's just the dollar value of everything that's potentially at risk. It's not an estimated loss. The loss under this 100-year scenario, if everything is flooded, shows building contents inventory in a subtotal by construction type, residential, industrial, commercial, etc. Across the county. This will also be done by individual jurisdiction. And then the tool also calculates business interruption, which is a bit of a misleading term because it looks at things like income, relocation, rental income loss, wage loss, etc. But the point of all this is that the numbers are very significant. Exposure is a bit misleading because you'll never have 100% loss of all of your exposed things in the floodplain. But the direct losses are intriguing to look at just to see how high the numbers could be in the worst case scenario. Again, looking at exposure, there are 2,358 buildings that will be at least moderately damaged in a 100-year flood event, 2,183 that could be completely destroyed, and that means damages that exceed 50% of the value of the building, not counting the land. This gives an example. I went the wrong way. Okay, so I'm sorry. This is coastal flood losses. If you look at the numbers here for exposure, this is along the river. So total exposure, total losses much, much lower than riverine, as would be expected, because you're comparing a very, very small geographical area of the county to a very large geographical area of the county. But there is that distinction that you'll be able to review. You can see the extent of coastal flooding along the Tunxet River, where those areas are in this graphic. So moving on to tornadoes, the HASIS model does now have a tornado loss modeling component to it. What we've typically done for tornadoes is looked at damages over the history of recorded damages using like the National Environmental Climate Inventory database from NOAA and other sources to say like, okay, here's the period of history that we have actual numbers. Here is the damages from here are the damages from those numbers. You could kind of analyze that over the historical period. So that data tells us, going back from 1950 to 2022, there's about a 50% chance in any given year that there could be a tornado. The total annualized damages over that period of history has been about $38,200 a year, which is fairly low, with the caveat that this does not capture. These are only reported damages on a limited number historic period, reported by people, to different authorities that make it up into this database. So limited utility to this data, but it does show us that there is some risk there. And 38, you can go 5-10 years without a tornado, but on average you're still accruing a $38,000 damage estimate in any given year. So using the HASIS tool, looking at tornado return frequencies, which is not commonly a way that most of us think about tornadoes. Again, it breaks it down by building content, inventory, and other losses. In this case, this example is the city of Laurel, Joint Base Andrews, Prince George's County overall. You can see that these building-related economic losses are fairly significant numbers based on the model for the risk of tornado-related losses or exposure. Moving on to hurricane, again, with HASIS in this particular module is only looking at hurricane wind, not looking at flooded related to hurricane. Again, a lot of different probabilistic scenarios are run in order to produce, annualized losses. But again, as you would expect from the map, you can see the pockets of more dense development are where the most of the hazard or the higher loss numbers occur. A little bit on social vulnerability. I've mentioned that several times now, and the primary reason, other than it's the right thing to do, I guess the secondary reason, the primary reason this is the right thing to do, but the emphasis on federal programs now and grants in particular give prioritization to areas that have social vulnerability. So we've done some analysis to look at those areas where there are people of 65 years or older, children, single parents, disabled households, other people whose vulnerabilities are higher than the average. And the most at-risk districts with the largest populations are in districts 1, 5, 6, and 8. So projects under the BRIC program, for example, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, or the FMA program, would get higher priority in those districts. And we use that in the analysis when we look at the projects that we want to put forward in the mitigation strategy section of the plan. Dam exposure and dam safety in general has more emphasis under FEMA's mitigation programs and under the 2022 mitigation plan guidance that becomes effective in April. So we did a much more robust analysis of potential dam breach and inundation zones for this plan than has been done in the past. So here you see the list of dams on the left, the buildings in the inundation zone were those dams to breach, and the property value exposure. So there's over $1 billion worth of property at risk if every dam in the county failed at the same time. So you got to take the number for what it is, but it does show you, it gives you an opportunity to look at the different dams and what's at risk as a result of a breach, and it gives you some means by which to prioritize projects in those areas. And this is just an example of of available inundation zones located in the city of Laurel for the districts listed. So you'll recall that slide where I listed all the hazards. That was just a brief glimpse into some of the details that are in the plan. So with all those hazards kind of quantified to the extent that we can, all the losses, potential losses quantified, and the prioritization of the hazards and all that combined, the idea is to use that risk and vulnerability data to inform the mitigation strategy. So like any strategic planning exercise, there's goals, there's objectives, and there's strategies to address all that. The mitigation goals and objectives in the last plan in 2017, there was kind of one overarching goal with a couple of sub bullets. What we've been doing now is looking at the goals and objectives, which don't change a lot typically from the last plan, but we are trying to sync those up better with the Maryland State Plan, other comprehensive and master planning initiatives like Plan 2035 at the PG County level, and the new mitigation policies. And what we're encouraging is to kind of categorize the goals to fit the types of things you want to do to address the risks and vulnerabilities. So there's the physical projects to address what's already at risk, what's in harm's way. Then there's capability and capacity building. That includes things like policy, planning, zoning. Do we have the resources to obtain and administer grants to address these challenges? Those types of kind of internal governance type issues. Public awareness and education is always a major component. A lot of these risks and vulnerabilities reside on private property. So it's not always the government's responsibility to address every problem. It needs buy-in and understanding from the people who share ownership in that risk. And then lastly, sort of the opposite of protecting what's already in harm's way is making sure that future forward-looking policy and planning prevents putting more things in harm's way by making uninformed decisions going forward. And that's sort of the planning and policy piece of it. So those are the 4 buckets that we're trying to develop with the goals and objectives, and have projects aligned to address each one of those. These are just some potential mitigation goal revisions. I'll pause on this one to get feedback from people on whether the direction that the advisory committee is going with the goals and objectives from a broad statement to these kind of 4 buckets makes sense. If anybody has any thoughts on that, be happy to hear that. Again, this first one is really project oriented. Second one is improving capabilities to deal with these evolving issues, public awareness, and then preventing future climate related damages. Assuming that makes sense. Okay. So we're nearing the end of the presentation, but are again interested in receiving input, and I'll provide some means by which you can provide more after the meeting. But for now, are there any specific projects or actions or ideas that you think should be included in the plan? We want to create a plan that's implementable and usable and realistic. We're trying to focus on a shorter list of projects this go around that are more meaningful and have more of a realistic chance of being completed on a 5-year planning horizon. Any specific problems and areas you like addressed? Any specific objectives that you think should be included, or any other thoughts in general that people have? Be happy to hear feedback on. Go ahead, Mark.
I'm not sure that this is germane, but there is a conversation going on about when there's a great disaster, to what degree things get rebuilt the way they were or in the same place, supposedly with improved engineering and construction techniques. Does that play into the planning? Let's talk about coastal flooding, which seems to be an obvious example of an area where it's only going to keep getting worse. There's a school of thought that says, why would you put good money after bad to rebuild in the same spot? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. We haven't gotten too far into that yet. I've been doing this for 20 plus years now, and there are places where I've worked where like retreat would never have been a discussion 10 years ago, where now people are saying, okay, we may be ready. Being that the county is not, an open coastal place that has, sea level rise. I mean, all these things are impactful, not to minimize it, but in terms of rebuilding and kind of long-term planning, long-term recovery planning, there are things that should be considered. It's that, it's a big stretch between Ocean City and PG County, where in Ocean City or Virginia Beach, Virginia, they may be looking a lot harder at retreat and rebuilding plans. We haven't tiptoed into that here, but it's a valuable conversation to have. If there's, I would envision it being more pockets of areas that, may not be wise to rebuild. Also, I was recently at a National Emergency Management Association conference where FEMA was talking about encouraging communities to start looking at recovery planning. We tend to focus on recovery planning more about like, okay, how do we provide public assistance and individual assistance to get things back up and running and quote unquote recovered. But there's that recovery, and then there's long-term recovery, like what are the strategic decisions that we need to make moving forward about rebuilding. And frankly, most of the United States doesn't do a really good job of the long-term recovery planning. People are starting to think about it, but yeah, in terms of this plan, I think it's a conversation we should have. I don't think we've stepped too far into it. I don't know if any of the folks from the county EM who are on have any thoughts about that or have done, more thinking about it than maybe we have during this planning process, I'd be interested to hear, but it's a great point.
Scott, this is Joey. I think it's on a case by case basis. I can't say that we've had those issues in terms of flooding, but I think in the past we've had issues with, say, something like ground movement, where it just wasn't feasible to uh, for the property owner to rebuild in the same areas.
Makes sense. I see a Melvin Mason has a hand up.
In the mitigation or process planning, has there been thought in boosting the involvement in community organizations such as the Community Emergency Response Team or the Amateur Radio Emergency Services to provide more training, centralized training and specific training to the county?
The short answer is yes, definitely. There's always a desire in these updates to improve the involvement of stakeholders, and certainly those you listed are stakeholders. The person who's done the outreach to those stakeholders is not on the call tonight, unfortunately, so I don't know if those particular entities have been invited to have more input, but yes, absolutely. The answer should be that we definitely want more input from those groups.
And we actually have invited members of our CERT teams to participate.
I thought so. I didn't want to commit to that without knowing for sure.
Greeting. My name is Alonzo Joy, and I'm from Upper Marlboro, CERT, and I'm following along with the presentation.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? So some of the next steps and other opportunities that you have to have more input. And again, I emphasize that this is on a real fast track. But there's a hazard mitigation survey. It's been posted on the county's website. There's the code there. I think you might be able to scan that with your phone right here on the screen. But if you could consider participating in the survey either over the screen or through the county's website. There's another opportunity to we created what's called a story map for the project, where you can click on the link in the middle, or again grab that QR code where it gives you a map of the county. You can drop a pin on the map and tell us, like, this culvert, this intersection always floods out. This is the damage it causes. This is the problem. It gives us the opportunity to take that big picture modeling data and zoom into some real life examples of areas that need to be addressed. And then again, and then the website for the county will have notifications for future public meetings, and everybody who popped their name into the chat tonight will be invited to the future public meetings. There'll be at least one more, if not two, before the adoption. The next one will be focused more on actual discussion about strategies. This was sort of an overview one with a really light overview of the risks. The next one will be focused on project development and strategies, but definitely encourage everybody to please participate however you can in any of these, by any of these different means. And certainly if you have questions or comments, you can contact us and I'll be happy to talk with you more. Also, if you can share these with other people who you think may be interested in participating, it's very important that we get the public and stakeholder participation to the plan, not only for the reviews, but also for the buy-in when we try to implement the projects.
Hey, Scott, do you want to remind folks again to place their names in the chat?
Yeah, if you came on a little bit late, if you could put your name and affiliation in the chat. If you're a resident, just also, just say resident. If you have any follow-up questions or you want to provide an email, feel free to do that too. But we'd like to capture everybody who participated. Mark?
Scott, I don't see where the chat. What do I do to get in the chat to put my name in?
If you look at the top of the screen, there's a bunch of different icons. The first one says people. The second one says chat.
I don't see that. I don't have icons across the top that I can see.
Are they down the side, maybe, depending
Well,
on your view?
I'm looking and I don't see anything.
I'm finding mine's at the bottom and
Okay.
it's encircled with as if you have a thought and some verbiage is in the middle of it. So circle like that. It's right
somewhere.
next to the participants.
Is
Yeah,
that where the it says show conversation? No.
Yeah, that's the one I'm using.
Okay. All right. I get it now. All right. I'll type my name in. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I think it might be it's slightly different depending on what viewer you're using, etc. But, right. Well, I feel like I lied because I didn't think it was going to take the whole hour, but it almost did. So appreciate all the participation. Are there any other questions or things that you think we missed and or could include, or welcome any of that feedback? All right, well, hearing none, I thank everybody very much for coming on and participating. Feel free to reach out to us. If you go to the county's webpage, shown on the screen over to the right, there's contact information there that will allow you to get to us if you have more specific questions that pop up or thoughts or ideas. But encourage you to go to any of these three methods of providing input and reach out to us that way, and we'd be happy to make sure that your thoughts are included.
Thank you,
Anything from
Scott. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anything the folks from the county would like to add before we close up?
Hi, this is Joey again. I want to thank everyone for participating tonight. And Scott, thank you for leading us through today's our first public meeting, and I look forward to having more dialogue in our next public meeting.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the meeting open for just a few more minutes because I see a few people are still typing into the chat. So I'm going to turn off my camera, leave the meeting open, but thank everybody for attending, and look forward to hearing from you more between now and sometime in January, where we have a document for you to review. Thanks again.